Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming. Just as a matter of curiosity, was anyone here living in Hudson in the 1940s? All right. Well, then we won't. I won't get any surprises that way. Someone knows a lot more than I do. It's interesting that this subject was really a big thing in 1945, 46, 47, all the way up till about 1950. And Willis Miller, and I don't know if you know Willis Miller, he was a reporter, he was the editor, he was the owner and part owner and publisher of the Hudson Star-Observer, never wrote about it. He wrote 20 books about different things in Hudson and missed this subject. I don't know why, but it's fascinating that Willis didn't touch upon it. Anyway, the title here is German Royal Jewels Missing and Solid Gold Tableware Ending Up on a Hudson Table. One of the reports I read said that it was also jewel-encrusted tableware, but it was just sitting out on the table as a normal tableware. So the background is here that the World War II ended in spring of 1945, and actually ended May 7th. For the Americans, they signed a treaty in Reims, France. The Russians weren't happy about that because they thought they carried a lot of the war and they needed to have their own signing. So there was a second signing 2 days later in Berlin. And that was at the instance of the Russians. Anyway, prior to that time, starting really in the second half of 1944, there was a lot of bombing going on in the Frankfurt area. And the Hesse family lived in Friedrichshof, Castle Friedrichshof, which is about 12 miles outside of Frankfurt. So they were concerned about their jewels and decided that they should do something to protect them. What they did is they gathered them up from all the family and they inventoried them, packaged them all up in neat little packages, sealed packages, and they put them in a zinc-lined wooden box, which they then soldered to make sure that it was waterproof. So they went through a lot of steps to make sure that the family jewels were protected. And then they dug a hole in the basement floor of the castle. Some reports say it was in the wine room. I don't know that it was that, but they did cover it with concrete, and then they constructed a false wall so people wouldn't even know the room was there. And the family members were actually moved from the castle and to other cottages that were around the grounds. And the Hesse was a kind of a state, what we consider a state in Germany, and there were about 30 of them. They went by different names like Hesse, Hamburg, Saxony, Bavaria, Berlin, and on and on. So they were part of a very large European royal family. It had ties to Great Britain. The Queen of Great Britain had ties back into Greece and into other European countries. So they are a huge royal family. All right. Now this was, or is, Kronberg Castle, sometimes called Friedrichshof. And it had over 100 rooms. If you can go to the next slide, Katie. Well, this is a family that actually should be there, and they were sort of evicted from the castle, and there were other cottages around the grounds, and the family members went to those cottages. But they kind of kept an eye on things, and they, the manager of the estate was a guy named Hesse, not Hesse, but Friedrich, and Friedrich was the one that had inventoried the jewels, so he was very well aware of the plans that they had made to take care of the family jewels. Next slide, please. So in 1945, it was the U.S. Army, Third Army, actually under General Patton, came to the area, and they found this wonderful place to have an officers' club. So that's what they did. After they moved the family out, they created a officers' rest and recreation club, and the club manager became Captain Kathleen Nash. she'll later pick up another name with another marriage, but her name changes frequently. That's why it was such a chore trying to research it, because she used various names, and we'll get to that later on. Now, the castle did have lots of furnishings that were left there in place when the family moved out, and Captain Nash was, in fact, quite dutiful in that she reported some missing pictures and a hand sculpture to Army authorities. So to deal with that and keep more stuff from being lifted from the property, a check-in desk was established, and it was handled by doorkeepers from the old staff. So the Hesse staff, who knew what the contents were of the castle, were sort of put in charge of being the gatekeepers. And while that may have been somewhat successful, there were still things that went missing over the years. And with the defeated Germany, I think there were a lot of people that were picking up stuff, that probably as souvenirs. And Kronberg Castle was no exception to that. Next slide. Captain Nash heard rumors from some of the staff that there were treasures hidden in the castle. So she authorized a search of the castle, and I think there was a corporal and a sergeant that were involved in that. And they did find the false wall. They broke through it with sledgehammers, found the fresh concrete, got out chisels and hammers, and chipped through there and found the box. They removed it and took it to Captain Nash's quarters. And she noticed that here were all of these neatly packaged jewels, tiaras, and all sorts of stuff that were in the box. So she contacted an officer who apparently she had met at the club, and who I'm not quite sure had a good relationship with her. So she brought him into the room, showed him the box and all of the jewels, and he enlisted his assistant, who was Major David Watson, brought him in, and they started plotting about what they could do to take possession of these jewels. And the jewels, as you notice, included gold, silver, bracelets, tiaras, diamonds, sapphires, rubies, emeralds, books, paintings. There were lots of stuff that were part of this treasure. And the jewels at that time, the initial report said 1.5 million. Later on, the newspaper said 2.5 million. In today's values, that would be about $45 million worth of jewels and other treasures.
Is there a reason the staff didn't say something?
Pardon?
Is there a reason the staff didn't say something because they're the ones that told her about it?
No.
Is that coming up?
No, well, I'll say that I think they considered court-martialing a corporal at one time, but apparently decided that he didn't really do anything. He didn't take them, and he didn't profit from them. All he did was dig them up. So anyway, what they did is, one of the worst things that they did is they removed these stones from the settings so that they could move them, market them more easily. And what they did is they destroyed a lot of the value, because the mountings, you couldn't even identify them, because they weren't part of the jewelry, weren't part of the tiaras or the crowns anymore. They were just loose jewels, but they made it much more easy to market. Nash and Durant went to Switzerland. They went to Bern, Basel, and Zurich, and they moved some of them there. A lot of the settings, and Watson went to Northern Ireland, where in November and December of 1945, he went primarily to pawn shops, and they did contact some of those pawn shop owners, and they did find out that, yes, they had purchased them, and however, they moved them on, and they were no longer available. Should notice that Watson did give a few jewels to his old girlfriend in Belfast, and he said his mother, a California, a sterling silver pitcher. The gold girlfriend in Belfast was named Peggy Harvey, and she reported that, yes, she did get some jewels and they were hidden in a candy bar. So they took some steps to make sure they were hiding things, but they were all discarded eventually as it came out. And Nash sent his sister in Hudson. This was an older sister. The dates vary when you're looking at ancestry, but she appears to be 3 or 4 years older than her sister, Captain Nash. And her name was Eileen. And she got the 36-piece solid gold service, some jewels, and the books. And these weren't just ordinary books. One was a bound volume of letters from Britain's Queen Victoria, and another one was an autographed book with paintings dating back to 1611. So quite important books. And Durant sent many books or jewels to his brother who lived in Falls Church, Virginia. They put them in glass jars and buried them in various places. And some of them were later dug up, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. And Durant used diplomatic pouches and envelopes stamped as official mail because they were concerned about trying to ship things through the mail and them being intercepted. But they expected they shipped about 30 boxes of these treasures to various places in the United States. And the Criminal Investigation Command got alerted to the theft when the Hesse family wanted to get the royal jewels because Princess Sophie of Greece was going to be marrying Prince George of Hanover in the spring. So she asked to have the jewels so that she could wear them as part of the wedding ceremony, which is a tradition among the Hesse family. And they actually knew that the jewels had been taken out of the castle because it was reported to Mr. Hesse, who was not Mr. Hesse, but to the estate manager who was aware of it. And they asked to have the jewels delivered back to them. And they got rebuffed by Captain Nash. She, in fact, refused to even meet with them, but sort of told them that, well, when we leave the castle, we'll give them back to you. We'll give the box back to you. So that was kind of the understanding. But when they didn't show up and Captain Nash was no longer there, she had gone back to the United States, as had Colonel Durant, they decided to go to the CID and Provost Marshal. And that's really in the spring of 1946 when action started, legal action and investigative action. Let me see. So the next, as I said, Heinrich Lang is the guy that was a manager, and the request for the information and for the jewels was ignored by Captain Nash. And both Nash and Durant were on terminal leave to the United States. Terminal leave meant that their terms of service was going to expire, and on a certain date they would be released from the Army and no further action would need to be taken. So they had kind of skipped out of Europe at this point. Colonel Durant was on the East Coast and he was trying to market the jewels, but he had no papers to back up the provenance of the jewels, so that was somewhat difficult. And Nash had a discharge from the Army, but she was in California visiting her younger sister. This sister, I think, was named Gladys Madison, and she was living in California. And interestingly enough, that the investigation was heating up. They quickly focused on the three, on Colonel Durant, on Captain Nash, and on Major Watson. And the CID and the MPs came to Hudson in looking for the not just the jewels, but looking for Captain Nash. And she evaded them. She called for a cab, and I think the MPs and the local sheriff were at the front door, and she skipped out the back door. And apparently the cab driver was the brother or brother-in-law of the sheriff, the Hudson sheriff at the time. He didn't know about that, though, so he took her to St. Paul. She caught a train from there and went to Chicago, where she met Colonel Durant. And they were married in May in Chicago. Actually, not in Chicago. They traveled 4.5 hours to the tip of Illinois down to Alton, Illinois. And they were married in Alton, Illinois. And that was on the 28th of May. And she was seen dining in a restaurant wearing this platinum watch with 606 diamonds on it. And Durant had purchased an auto with a diamond worth $26,000 apparently. And they were arrested on June 3rd. Actually, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and they were supposedly in the honeymoon suite of the LaSalle Hotel, opening champagne, one report says, and being in bed, what the other report says. So in any case, they were arrested on June 3rd, and Major Watson, meanwhile, was still in Europe, in Frankfurt, so he was arrested by the Criminal Investigation Division in Frankfurt in May of 1946. He was an easy one to capture. The sister, by the way, in Hudson was named Mrs. John C. Lonergan. Couldn't find much about her except her and her husband are both dead. They had 2 sons, James and John, and they're both dead. So I don't think there are any Lonergan families in the community that I'm aware of. But in any case, Eileen was the older sister, and maybe that's why she got the jewels. I'm not sure. She could have shipped them to the sister in California also. This is Nash and Durant. They were getting off a plane. They decided that the crime was committed in Germany and they should be taken back to Germany for trial. So they were flown back to Frankfurt in spring of 1946. And next slide shows them again being escorted from the airport. Well, they wanted to be. They weren't yet.
Still in the military stuff, so they're not done.
And that was a big argument that we'll see here. Go to the next slide, and you'll see this is Major David Watson. And David Watson actually plays sort of a minor role in all of this. And you'll see that later that comes to assist him in his struggles. Next slide. This is the court-martial board that was assembled. I think it went between 7 and 10 colonels that were on this board. And this shows, I think, a picture in the Pentagon, and all of the jewels or part of them are laid out in front of them. Next slide. And here are more of them, and you can see some of the books on the front. And there's platters in back, and there's necklaces and diamonds and earrings and all sorts of stuff. So and this represents only about half or less than half of the jewels. Okay. So they're all back in Frankfurt, and they're going to trial. The charges for both Nash and Durant were AWOL. The reason AWOL is because when they were in the United States, they were claiming that, hey, we're no longer in the Army. You can't charge us. But the Army said, yes, we can, because you weren't really released while you were on terminal leave. You had not yet met the dates, and we recalled you, and we sent you both orders to report to Fort Sheridan, Illinois. Well, none of them reported to Fort Sheridan, so they were considered AWOL. which is absent without leave. And they were all charged with conspiracy, larceny for all three, fraud for Nash and Durant. For some reason, this didn't apply to Major Watson. And they were all charged with conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman and bringing discredit upon the military service for all three of them. Claimed defense by both Nash and Durant was that they didn't have any jurisdiction over them, no personal jurisdiction, and that's one of the things that you need to have. You need to have a body, you need to have someone in custody, legally in custody, to be able to bring charges against them. And they're claiming that because they were on terminal leave, that they were no longer subject to the Army and subject to military jurisdiction. They also claimed that the jewels had been abandoned by the Hesse family and that the jewels were legitimate spoils of war and that people were doing this all over Germany. And the court-martial board didn't buy that. They said there are hundreds of thousands of soldiers here and they may pick up a knife or something on the battleground, but they're not stealing family jewels. And they claimed also that the Hesse family had ties to the Nazi party. Why there may have been sympathizers, I didn't find any evidence of close ties or that they really belonged to any support groups for the Nazi party. And Watson claimed that I was only doing what everybody else is doing. And he also said that he had no mens rea, which is a legal term for intent to steal, that he really didn't intend to steal. This stuff just showed up and he was asked to help move it. So that was kind of his claim. Okay, so what happened? They were guilty on all charges for both Nash and Durant. Watson is found guilty only of receiving stolen property and conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. They were all got military or dishonorable discharges. One of the things that means that you can't have any benefits after you retire, no retirement benefits, no medical benefits, nothing. And they were sentenced to various terms. And one of the things, there were a lot of articles that I read out of the reporter for the Army, by the Army archivist and historian, who said all three of them went to Leavenworth. Well, that isn't true. Nash received a 5-year sentence, and she went to the Alderson, West Virginia Women's Federal Prison, and Colonel Durant got a 14-year sentence to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, and Major Durant got a 3-year sentence to Fort Hancock, New Jersey. Now, the first one to go to trial was Captain Nash, and her trial lasted about a month. And then second was Watson, and Watson only lasted about 2 weeks. And then the third was Colonel Durant, and Colonel Durant's lasted about 5 months. Was started in Frankfurt and then eventually was moved to the United States and concluded in Washington, D.C. And I think one of the reasons it was moved there was because they wanted to compel testimony from his brother, who had received and buried some of the jewels. And the brother refused to go to Germany, and they had no jurisdiction over him until they moved those proceedings to the United States, and then they issued a subpoena, and he was forced to testify. I should note also that while it says that Colonel Durant received a 15-year sentence, that eventually was dropped to 14 because he spent so much time in prison waiting for all of this that they granted him a year's reduction. Nash convinced a district court to allow her to be released on a habeas corpus, which is sort of release the body, appeal to a district court. And she convinced the district court that she was, in fact, no longer part of the military because she was on terminal leave and scheduled for discharge. Well, that was a very short-lived escape because the appeals court quickly overruled the district court and she went back to prison. She got out for a short time in September, 10th of September, 1947, and she was back in within about 2 months. I think in the end of 47, she went back to prison. She did use her short-term freedom to visit her husband down in prison in Atlanta. And then she visited her sister in Hudson. And then she made the trip to California to visit her sister, Gladys Madison. She did that before she got sent back to prison. And she eventually was paroled in July of 1949. So she only served about 18 months total, a fairly short term. And they did appeal to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court just denied certiorari, refused to hear the case. So they all went back to prison to serve their terms. Now, Watson made repeated efforts to obtain a presidential pardon because he felt that he should not have been part of this. He really digged them up, and he wasn't responsible for all the planning, although he doesn't explain the candy bar with the diamonds in it to his old girlfriend or the silver pitcher to his mother. Anyway, he does go seek the presidential pardon. He was paroled in December of 1947. He returned to California, where he resumed a career in retail. So he served as a manager of a Safeway store. He was manager of a handy spot company, owner of a Hallmark gift and card shop, and he actually managed a jewelry store with his wife. Had a good background for that. He did solicit endorsements of good conduct and good character from friends and acquaintances, and he accumulated 275 letters. And he continued to try to get a presidential pardon, but the Army wasn't supporting his efforts. They would not entertain his application for a presidential pardon until 1957, when the Army finally said, okay, we're not going to support it, but we're not going to oppose it. So they're failing to oppose it. And the work of his congressman from California did get him a pardon from President Eisenhower in 1957. And you'll see on the next slide that he actually was decorated by Eisenhower back during the World War II. He was involved with the Quartermaster's Corps and apparently very successful there. He also received awards from Belgium, from France, and from the Soviet Union. So maybe we cut a little slack to Major Watson. Next slide. Durant, different story. Durant got the harshest and longest sentence because he was considered to be the head of the conspiracy. He was a senior officer. He was a colonel. The next step down to be a light colonel, and then a major, which is where Watson was, and then down to captain, which is where Nash was. He got a degree from the University of Illinois in 1931, went to Washington, D.C., and was working as an accountant in Washington, D.C., primarily in personnel. But while he was there, he attended Georgetown University and got a law degree in 1941. He married Elvira Deller in 1930, and they had 2 sons, and he divorced her in 1944. Married Kathleen Nash in May of 1946, May 28th. This was the kind of shotgun wedding down in Alton, Illinois. And it was done because they were very well aware that if the husband and wife were married, they couldn't testify against each other, or they wouldn't have to. So this is certainly a marriage of convenience. And according to the Army records, which I seriously doubt, later they were reported as being divorced. That I think is true, but living together. I have no evidence that they were living together. And as I mentioned, Durant's prison sentence was reduced to 14 years for the time he'd already spent in jail. And he was released from prison in 1952. He died on 19 of December 1984 at North Bay Village, Miami-Dade County, Florida. And to find the grave shows his headstone, shows that he has a headstone, that he was cremated, but the disposition of his ashes is unknown. So Durant actually served, he went into prison in 1947, late 1947, 12/11/1947, and he was released then as in 1952. So he served about 5 years, only about a third of his sentence. This was young Jack in his University of Illinois yearbook, and much better days back then. Now we come to Our Lady from Hudson. She had multiple names, and I'm going through, this is really the problem going through Ancestry. She had so many different names that you try to track all of them. And when she was Kathleen Nash, there was a Kathleen Nash that was a movie star too. So there's hundreds of records that I went through trying to find out who she really was and how you could best identify her. And you can see that the name Veronica Kathleen Burke is a legitimate one because it's on her Minnesota birth record. She wasn't born in Hudson. She was born in Ramsey County, Minnesota, so probably over in St. Paul, because St. Paul had hospitals that Hudson didn't have at that time. So the next one shows up in 1910 and 1920 census, has a Hudson address, but shows her as Veronica with a K, Venecia Burke. I don't know where that name came from. And then the third one you see down there is Veronico, ending with an O, and that is on her son's 1923 Arizona birth certificate. And she is listed as being 20 years old at the time. And her son's name is Richard. He's no longer with us. I think he died in 1971, and he was living in Tucson. And on her Social Security Administration application, it shows as Kathleen with a different spelling again. And she has an address as Veronica Nash in Phoenix, Arizona directory, and one is Kathleen Nash in Chandler, Arizona. And she shows as Kathleen B.B. Nash in the 1940 census with a Arizona address. And Mrs. Kathleen B. Nash on her marriage notice, that's the one that was in Illinois. And she has a habit about not wanting to confess what her age is. So even when she married the colonel, she faked her address by 10 years. So she claimed to be 33, and she was actually 43 at the time. We see in the 1950 sentence, she's back supposedly in Hudson, and that's possible because she was released from prison paroled in 1949, so she might have come back temporarily to Hudson. But she shows as a wedding license in Arizona. She was married in Arizona at age 19, and that license is dated April 10th, 1923. That was when she was married to Kenneth Nash. That was her first husband. That was the one that was with her in high school. He was her boyfriend in high school. And she has as her death notice Captain Kathleen Vonnie Nash Durant. And the Vonnie is short for Veronica, I assume. And her death certificate was issued in Phoenix, Arizona in 1972. She was 69 years old at the time. She died shortly before her 70th birthday.
So what's with the 1972 Nebraska death notice? She has two?
That's the 1972 Nevada death notice, is that what you're asking me? I bring that up later, that I suspect that might be an address at the time. that's why I'm so concerned about the historian and the archivist for the U.S. Army when he's saying they were living together after they got out. I find no evidence of that, and I looked through hundreds of newspapers and through Ancestry, and I don't see anything like that at all. Kathleen's birth date, I think we can go by that. That's accurate, 23 October 1902. That was the Minnesota birth record. If you look at genealogy and look at the various years of records for census and such, they say about 1903, about 1904, about 1906, about 1913. So, questionable. She did lie about her age to enlist in the Army. She claimed to be 32. She was actually 42 at the time. And her former mother-in-law, Genevieve O'Day, said that she's 43 and cited her son's age, Kenneth, as proof of Kathleen's age. And her sister in LA said, her age is her own business and nobody else's. She is a woman. Very interesting. And apparently Kathleen took it to heart and used multiple dates. As I say, she was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, Richard Burke and Adeline Thompson. Adeline is also referred to in many cases as Addie, and she shows up as at the head of the household in some of the following censuses. The reason being is that her husband, Richard, was a switchman for the railroad, and he got run over by a locomotive up in Superior, Wisconsin in 1907. So Veronica Kathleen Nash actually was an orphan at age 4. She did go to Hudson High School. Supposedly was not a great student. Had to be helped through the classes by her boyfriend, who was Kenneth Emerson Nash, and he was one of the members of the board that put together the annual yearbook, which is I think called Hudson Blue or something Blue. True Blue, right. So he was apparently pretty competent. She not necessarily so great in school. They moved to Arizona about 1920 or 21, where he was a golf course manager. And they adopted a daughter in 1926. She lived in Hudson as Mrs. Donald Wilcox, and I believe he was a auto mechanic. They're both passed away also. The son Burke, as I mentioned, passed away in 1971. He was born on May 3rd, 1923. And Kathleen lived in Arizona for 19 years before she divorced Nash in 1941, prior to entering the Army. So she left the ex-husband behind and 2 children, the son and the adopted daughter, and she joined the Army. I should also mention here that the 1910 census showed that she was living in Hudson in Ward 3. The 1920 census said she was living in Hudson on 2nd Street. The 1930 census I could not find, but the 1940 census shows her living in Maricopa, Arizona. 1950 census, she's back in Hudson on 4th Street. And the marriage index shows that she was living in Hudson at 1409 3rd Street. I think that's kind of questionable because it was done by AI, and I don't think they had any actual records to support that. That would have been somewhere on this street, 1409 on 3rd Street. Anyway, the military career, she trained at Fort Des Moines in Iowa. She also went to OCS, or Officers Candidate School in Des Moines, Fort Des Moines. She had worked as a secretary to the transportation officer at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, prior to enlisting. And I think that was probably the reason that gave her the idea of, hey, why don't I join the Army and see the world? Which worked out pretty well for her. She served as a mess officer until April 1943 when she was transferred to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, and then later transferred to the Holabird Signal Depot in Baltimore, Maryland. Went to Europe in 1945 and became manager of the Kronberg Castle on 15th of June, 1945. So she was there from 15th of June until she left in the spring of 1946 on her terminal leave. She was court-martialed in 1946, discharged from the Army, and has a 5-year imprisonment, which we see she only served about 18 months. She died on April 1972 and was buried in Phoenix, Arizona in the St. Francis Catholic Cemetery. I did find a Social Security death notice, which showed her last residence as being 89109 Las Vegas, Clark City, or Clark County, Nevada. Now, interesting that she was buried in the St. Francis Catholic Cemetery, because that's where Kenneth Nash is buried, in the St. Francis Catholic Cemetery. So at least they reunited in death in the same cemetery. I think they both have separate stones and separate locations. But he died actually at age 52, a young death. So he was dead 20 years before she was. So let's go on. What's happened to the fortune? As I say, less than half is recovered, and they don't expect much to be recovered because once the stones are removed, they're pretty subject to being going anywhere and unlikely to be found and even being recognized since they're no longer in the settings. The MP supposedly seized the cutlery and the jewels and the books when they were in Hudson. They said they spent all night there inventorying and photographing the jewels. And those the family got back, because those are the ones that you see displayed at the court-martials. And they also recovered 102 jewels that apparently were in the possession of Colonel Durant, that he had been storing in a railroad station locker. And the customs official had reported that he had shipped $12,000 in jewels in an unsealed cigar box. So they probably recovered those also. The auto dealer, John Burroughs, which sold him the $26,000 car, was sued for the diamonds and lost, and had to wind up giving back the diamonds. So $26,000 car in 1946 seems like an awfully expensive car.
Oh,
I don't know what kind of car that would have been. Anyway, there was also $28,000 that were recovered in buried jars in Falls Church, Virginia, where his brother, Colonel Durant's brother, lived. And they were claimed by the attorney, so that was agreement that would be part of the attorney's fees. Well, the court didn't agree. They said, no, those goes back to the Hesse, so they got the $28,000 back. And it wasn't until 1951, August of 1951, that the Department of the Army did finally return the jewels to the family, what was left of them. And they did include 270 items, platinum brace covered with 405 diamonds, platinum watch with the 606 diamonds. I believe that was the one that she was wearing in the restaurant in Chicago. Sapphire weighing 116.20 carats, and a group of loose diamonds weighing 282.77 carats, a gold bracelet with diamonds and loose stones consisting of 54 rubies and 67 emeralds. And surprisingly, years later, in 2014, 2 paintings were discovered by the Monument Men Foundation, and the family had the records showing that those, yes, were in fact family paintings, and they were returned to the family accordingly. And this whole thing did not get overlooked by Hollywood. They made a movie of it called The Hessian Conspiracy, starring Billy Zane, who was probably a grade C actor. And I've seen a couple of things he's done, but he usually plays a bad guy. So he's properly cast here. And I don't know the Lynn Renee, but this movie was shot in Belgium. And if anybody wants to go back and look for this, it's probably available on the internet, I would guess. That kind of concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have any. Yes?
question. Do you know where Eileen Lonergan lived in Hudson? Where the house was where the jewels were discovered.
Yes, I have what I think is her address in my little notes here. I remember making a note of it. I have too many notes here. I have 1421 3rd Street. 1421 3rd Street. That's this street right out front here.
This is 1004.
Yeah, so it would be up that way. It would be at the northern end of 3rd Street. So if you want to take a drive up that way, you can probably find the house. I was surprised because they said that the house was surrounded, and I thought, how could she walk out the back door and get in a cab if the house is surrounded? So apparently, it was a very poor job of surrounding the house by the MPs, or there weren't enough MPs. Yes.
Were the siblings of any of them ever prosecuted or anything done to them? Seems like, especially the brother who buried, it seems like he knew they were stolen. Plus, the woman in Hudson, I don't know, to get these, jewel encrusted gold plates when you think something was suspicious there.
Yeah.
I don't think the settings will ever be found because those, on all likelihood, the gold and silver was melted down, and you won't find those at all. And the jewels, the two paintings that were returned by the Monument Men Foundation were owned or were purchased by a lady in Army Special Services. And I don't know if she got any remuneration for surrendering them, but she did. And I don't know what she paid for them either. But I don't think there were any members of any of the families that are here. They're either up in the Willow River Cemetery or the Father Burke, the one that was killed up in Superior, Wisconsin, and run over by a train. He's buried at the Catholic Cemetery in Hudson. So I think I've tried to count for all of the family.
None of the siblings ever got in trouble for receiving stolen property?
No, although they said when the brother-in-law or the brother in Falls Church, Virginia died, he had a very sizable estate for someone who had such a mediocre position. Because he was working for the government. And I can clue you, having worked 30-some years for the government, they don't pay a lot. So yeah, but they never recovered anything from that, and apparently it did not consist of jewels. It consisted of money, and maybe he sold them on the side to someone, found a fence, got some money, and lived pretty happily. And I don't think that went back to the colonel either. And I looked in the papers and I looked in everything that I could find in Ancestry for the 23 years when she got out of prison until she died. There's no evidence at all of them ever contacting each other or ever being in touch with each other. And I think she moved back out to the West. I think she went out to Las Vegas, and that's probably where she was living, and that's where she died. And she's buried in Phoenix, and he was down in Florida, in the Miami area of Florida. No evidence that they ever contacted again. So I think that when the Army historian and archivist wrote that, I don't know what he was basing it on, because I can't find any evidence. No records in Ancestry, no records in newspapers. Any other questions? Yes.
How common were situations like this, similar situations during that specific war?
Well, the court-martial board took note of that and said, yeah, you might have, guys picking up rifles in the Pacific in Japan and shipping them back, and that was fairly common. Luger pistols off the battleground, that sort of thing. But no one stealing family jewels that came from a family castle. And the lady that was in charge, I can't forget what her name was, Margareta, I think, and she was the head of the Hesse family at that time in Frankfurt. She knew that they were the family jewels and they belonged to the family and they were not subject to seizure as contraband. And they weren't something that was just laying around. They had been taking steps to protect them and documented them and inventoried them. So it wasn't the same as someone scooping something up off of a battlefield. So the argument that, hey, everybody's doing it didn't carry any weight with the board. And I think they sort of wanted to preserve the integrity of the military too by saying that, you got thousands of troops running around, but no one is doing this sort of thing. Just the size of the scope of this, I think, had a lot to do with how the court-martial treated it. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you.